And then it will be made available up on the Great Plains Tribal Leaders Health Board YouTube site. At this time, it's my great pleasure, and I'm very excited to introduce to you Amashke, a sister of mine who I've had the opportunity to get to know over the last number of years. She's a great trainer when it comes to providing information about trauma-informed care. She comes through us through the National Native Children's Trauma Network, and it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Marilyn Zimmerman from the University of Montana. Thank you.
Thanks, Annie. Good morning, everyone. I apologize that I'm not in Rapid City. I so wanted to be there in person. I wanted to be there in person because some of the activity, or one activity in particular that we're going to do today, is going to challenge us and our imaginations, and I hope you'll lean into it with me. So let's get started. First, want to let you know that very often when we're talking about trauma histories, historical trauma, traumatic events, that it can trigger some of our memories. It can trigger some of the experiences that we have. And so just know that it's okay to step away from your computer, and it's okay to ask for support. There should just be really sort of low-key examples, nothing dramatic or traumatic, but just in case, please feel free to step away and find support with your peers or with your professional support network that you have there in Rapid City. I want to talk just a little bit about who we are as the National Native Children's Trauma Center at the University of Montana, and let you all know that we are part of the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. Some of you who work clinically may have heard of us. We have been funded since 2007 by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration to be what is known as a Category 2 trauma center in the network. That means that we serve as a treatment and services adaptation center, a technical assistance center, and just supports to tribes around the country. For 15 years, we were the only center funded to serve American Indian Alaska Native children, youth, and their families. But recently, in the latest round of grant support, 2 other trauma centers were brought on board. What we're real excited about. One is at the University of New Mexico, and I'm not from Oklahoma, so I'm going to butcher this. Muskego Creek, I'm not sure. Anyway, it's in Oklahoma. I want to tell you how we got started. So we are housed in the College of Education at the National Native, or at the University of Montana, and we started out as a state-funded center or a direct service center in 2003, funded by SAMHSA. And it was about that time that teachers and administrators and counselors across the state of Montana were reaching out to the College of Ed faculty and staff saying, you know, our kids are being diagnosed with ADD and ADHD, but the medications don't seem to be helping, and the strategies that we've been trained to support those students that suffer from ADD and ADHD don't seem to be helpful. Could it be something else, or what else could it be? And so the original director, Dr. Daryl Stoley, started to look around the country, and he found the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, and he found Dr. Marlene Wong, who was the superintendent of the Los Angeles Unified School District. And at the time, they had developed a school-based trauma treatment, small group trauma treatment model called Cognitive Behavioral Intervention for Trauma in Schools, which means, so 8 to 10 students per semester or per group per semester would learn to understand the symptoms, the origins of trauma, their own symptoms, getting some pro-social skills building. And they also had a trauma narrative where they told the hardest part of their trauma within the context of the group, keeping the other students safe. Well, so Daryl got pretty excited about it. We got trained in the CBITS model, and the big idea was that we would pilot in 2 reservation communities in Montana. And the reason for the pilots is because the CBITS was developed for an urban Latino population. Now, could this urban Latino population, could our kids have anything in common with them? So we started asking, tell us about your students. And they said, well, you know, our students are living in communities that are experiencing community violence, like gang violence. Yep, so are ours. They're living in households where caregivers impaired either because of addiction or a mental health disorder like depression or anxiety or PTSD. Ours too. They are also living in households where they are experiencing or witnessing violence intimate partner violence. Ours too. So you get the picture. So we asked, being good researchers, we asked two questions. Do American Indian children suffer from PTSD-like symptoms or childhood traumatic stress? And if they do, will this evidence-based treatment model work in the context of a rural reservation American Indian population? And the answer to both of those questions in our pilot was yes to both, very high rates of PTSD-like symptoms, actually. And so what we had to do with CBITS then, because we had an ethical responsibility to respond to the kinds of needs that our kids had, we took that whole CBITS curriculum or CBITS treatment model and developed a curriculum, Students Trauma and Resilience, or STAR, which is free, which you can have access to. And I'll give Annie that information if anyone's interested later on. So we quickly found out, though, like the rest of the nation and the rest of the network, that you could not embed an evidence-based trauma treatment model in the context of a system that wasn't trauma-informed, a building that wasn't trauma-informed, right? That didn't have the full support of administration and staff and faculty. So we, in about 2010, 11, we started looking at systems change. How do we do this work? How do we create trauma-informed systems? Because for many of us, not just in rural reservation communities or even urban centers that serve American Indians, for many of us, there just isn't the capacity to have that master's level or PhD level individual for access to do this treatment model. So we had to think about some universal strategies and some targeted strategies, or indicated strategies, not just targeted strategies. And so we began to look at system change to support kids, and that's where we are today. And so somewhere in the United States, we're working, if you think of any system that touches the life of a child in need, child welfare, justice, courts, schools, primary care, mental health, we're probably working with a tribe. So here's some basic, what we're going to learn today. Oh, there's a hand up, Annie.
There is a hand up, and Danny Morrison would like to provide some insight, just real briefly.
Okay.
Yes, good morning, Dr. Zimmerman. My name is Danny Morrison, and I have a few colleagues who work for you, actually. But yeah, so I just was, when you were trying to pronounce Muskogee Creek, it's Muskogee.
Uh-huh.
But I also wanted to just interject just a small piece in there that when we are talking about our tribes, it's really, I think, important to take time to try and pronounce the names correctly, as that also can be a trigger or a create a negative response when if someone can't pronounce it correctly, that if they don't ask for help, that it's not just like pushed to the side or ignored that you can't pronounce it properly. That there's a, that can also create some those triggers. So I just wanted to say that because I think that that's really important too, in all this really good information you're sharing, that we start off in a good way, that is kind of proceeded in that direction. So thank you.
Yes, would you pronounce it correctly, please?
Muskogee.
Muskogee.
Muskogee, yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Danny, how are you on this? Aren't you from Montana, in Montana?
I am. I'm Ogallala Lakota, and I work in Bozeman here.
Okay.
and I worked with OLO here, but yeah, I worked majority of my life. I'm raised in Montana, and and do all my work in Montana. So yeah. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that correction. Yes, it is important that we learn to pronounce our tribal identity in the way that, in our own tribal ways. It's the same way that we must insist upon folks pronouncing our names correctly and not shortening them to make them much more palatable to the American tongue. So, learning objectives today. So we're going to look quite a bit at historical trauma and the consequences to American Indian and Alaska Native communities. We're going to get a basic understanding of trauma's impact on development of children and adolescents, and briefly look at some educational outcomes for children and adolescents who have been exposed to violence, including grief and loss, which is where we found out in the first study that we did in the 2 reservations, is that the students began telling us that, watching mom and dad fight is really hard, but losing grandma's harder. Losing my favorite uncle in his 40s because he's died in a car wreck is harder. My best friend, dying by suicide is harder. For some of us that were involved in child welfare, we thought it might be a red herring that these children might be very protective of their families. But so we did a second study, and indeed we were wrong. I was wrong. So we found out at the time, which was pretty cutting edge, that for American Indian and youth in our state anyway, that what accounted for their PTSD-like symptoms or childhood traumatic stress symptoms was about equal between exposure to violent events, but grief and loss in their lives. So why do we need to talk about trauma? So there's some of us that believe it's our most pressing health issues that can be contributed back to, and then we'll talk about the ACEs study, the Average Childhood Experiences study that really does link the what happens in your childhood can be linked to your health outcomes later in life. We also want to really emphasize that trauma is preventable, that it's not a, what's the word I'm looking for? A given that all just being human we will experience trauma. We will experience trauma, but we can learn how to better support our children and our relatives so that it doesn't have long-term impact. For those folks who have been impacted by trauma, we can heal from it. There is hope. We're not stuck in some of the what some people might call maladaptive coping ways that we've engaged in the past. To support us, we can heal from our trauma. And finally, it asks the right question. So I was raised by my grandma, and back when she was when I was very little, and she was one of those grandmas that would do this, shake her finger, and she would say to our relatives, "Hey, what's wrong with you? Sober up, get your kids back." Or, "Hey, what's wrong with you? Stop beating on that woman, treat her good," that sort of thing. Well, we have learned that the better question is, instead of asking what's wrong with you, we started to ask what's happened to you. And even beyond what's happened to you is what's happened to you and how do you remember it? What kind of meaning do you make of that event? What kind of supports did you have around that event? So instead of sort of blaming and asking what's wrong, we ask the right question, which is what's happened to you. So what is trauma? It is the experience of a real or perceived threat to the life or safety of yourself or the life and safety of a loved one that causes an overwhelming sense of terror, horror, or helplessness or fear. So that's how it begins. But again, it's that perceived threat is just as impactful as real threat, right? And it's the experience of it that causes overwhelming sense of terror, horror or helplessness. Now, we were all together in that large conference room, and all of a sudden that conference room floor dropped 3 feet and all of us went boom down 3 feet. In about 6 weeks' time, a lot of us might have a different account or a different feeling about that event. Some of us may not want to walk into a large conference room for a while, right? Some of us may have experienced it as something dramatic, but nothing traumatic, right? So it really is the individual's perception. So none of us can say, oh gosh, that happened to me and I got over it, so you'll be okay too. That's a key element of understanding the children and students, children and youth we work with, is it's their perception, it's their understanding of that event, not ours. So we can't say, oh, I don't know why you would be thinking suicide from breaking up with your girlfriend. There's a whole bunch of girls out there that want to date you. You know, you're going to be okay. That's not what that student is experiencing at that time. They are feeling helpless and sometimes hopeless. So there are types of trauma. For example, there's what we call acute trauma. That can be a car wreck, a range fire, Hurricane Katrina. It's that one-time event that happens to folks it's not chronic. It's not multiple or different types of trauma or the same kind of trauma happening repeatedly. So that's what chronic trauma is. So I think we think about our students, think about our kids, think about our relatives, what kinds of traumas are they repeatedly experiencing? And complex trauma is that repeated experience and has developmental impacts, but it's also what makes it complex is it is often at the hand of the caregiver that has a greater impact. And then historical trauma, the events that of genocidal intent, basically experienced by people based on our collective identity. And we're going to be talking about that this morning in a little bit more depth than usual. So here's the adverse childhood experiences. Again, I'm assuming everyone has heard about the adverse childhood experiences. In the late 90s, a medical doctor had an obesity study in Kaiser Permanente, and many of his patients were dropping out of the program. He went to look at charts thinking they weren't being very successful at losing weight, but they were being very successful. And these were folks that were like 300-400 pounds overweight. This wasn't just, oh, I need to lose the last 10. And so he asked them to come back in, and he started interviewing them to try to figure out what was happening. And one day he misspoke. And instead of saying, how old were you with your first sexual experience, he asked the woman, how much did you weigh? And surprisingly, she said she knew, and she said, I was 40 pounds, and it was with my father. And she said, thank you for asking. So that blew his mind. So he began to have conversations with the rest of the patients, and there seemed to be some sort of theme or trend that many of the folks that were suffering from obesity in his study had experienced childhood sexual abuse by a caregiver. And so he got with the CDC. They did another study, and they interviewed 17,000 adults, mostly white, well-insured, middle class, and they asked 10 questions about childhood, and they found out that for many folks, there was a lot of trauma in our childhood histories. And what is known as about the ACE study, or ACEs, is they gave you 10 questions, and if you could answer yes to the question, you got an ACE score of 1. So for example, the question might be, did you ever experience neglect? It didn't matter if you experienced neglect from 3 to 7, and then things got better. It's just at any time in your childhood, did you experience neglect? Did you experience sexual abuse? And it didn't matter if it was started at 3 or if it started at 15 or if it was a rape at 21. Just, have you ever been sexually abused? And if you could say yes to that, that was another score. So then you would have a 2. And they found for those folks whose ACE scores were 4 or more, they were there. It was exponentially, their chronic diseases went up, like COPD and heart disease, ischemic heart disease, those sorts of things. So basically the correlation is that what's happening in childhood is impacting us later in life. What ACEs did not do, though, it did not ask questions about community environment. It didn't ask questions about racism, structural violence, those sorts of questions. Oops. So we have done some studies of ACEs in Indian country. So the original ACE study, the respondents had at least one ACE, 64% of them, but for a 7-tribe study, over 86% of us have at least one ACE in our lifetime. In South Dakota alone, 83%. ACE score 4 or more, 12% of the original ACE study folks experienced 4 or more ACEs, whereas for males, 29% and the tribes and 35% of females had experienced traumatic events. And in South Dakota, again, just the general 32% of the entire population. So you can see that we have experienced a lot of trauma. We have a lot of resilience. We have a lot of healing. We have a lot of hope in our communities, but this is the study on the impacts of ACEs. So again, that notion of a link between ACEs and well-being. So very often in order to cope with certain aspects of the traumas that we've experienced, whether it's sexual abuse or neglect or being raised by an impaired caregiver because of, depression, we use certain strategies to try to cope. And sometimes it's using alcohol and drugs. Sometimes it's using IV drugs. Sometimes we engage in parasuicidal behavior or have suicide attempts, or we just engage in very risky behavior. What we also know is that there's a poor academic performance that comes out of young people who have experienced trauma. And sometimes they have an inability to maintain a professional employment, or not professional employment. So that's sort of the overview of trauma. Let's talk about the impacts of historical trauma. So first, I want to ask you all to think about historical trauma in the context of its political meaning, its psychological meaning, what the research shows, and how tribal communities are either identifying it and or developing strategies and resources to support those folks that have experienced historical trauma. So the political ramifications are our understanding that colonization of Indigenous peoples in North America, well, throughout the world, really begins from a political stance where we have experienced the colonization strategies of the federal government that were, what's the word? Detrimental seems so small. Well, it was not just physical genocide, but it was cultural genocide also, and it was purposeful. And the assimilation policies that the federal government engaged in weren't helpful to the well-being of American Indian families. We want to think about what are the psychological impacts to a group of people that have this similar experience with colonization, and really does it make a difference? So what happened to my great-great-grandmother, does it really have a psychological or emotional impact on me today? And some of the research coming from tribal communities is it actually does. And so we're going to take a little look at the research and what it's shown for tribal communities. I think that for me, it's really important that we address and look at the research for historical trauma, because so many of us have experienced people rolling their eyes, oh, this again, right? Are you going to talk about historical trauma again? When are you guys going to get over it? Well, it's a little more complicated than just having a common history with our communities and our relatives. So we're going to take a look at that, and we'll take a look at the impact on not just individual well-being, but tribal community well-being. Let's see. Okay. So this slide I always use, and it's a very old slide of mine. I always want people that are non-tribal members, particularly teachers or service providers, to understand that the tribal constructs of nations before contact were complex, right? We had ways of governing, we had ways of healing, we had ways of family roles, community roles, that we had a collective way of surviving and being in the world. And that the impacts of these colonization, I've got to pick one, of colonization were cumulative over time, and that they really have had an intergenerational impact on our well-being. So Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart is the woman from the native researcher who has first coined and defined historical trauma for the American Indian people. And she defines it as the cumulative psychological wounding across generations, including lifespan, which emanates from massive group trauma. Another Native researcher, Teresa Evans Campbell, has defined it as a collective complex trauma inflicted on a group of people who share a specific identity or affiliation. It's the legacy of numerous traumatic events a community experiences over generations, and encompasses the psychological and social responses to that trauma. I like this definition very much. Before I go on, I want to make sure that I'm very, very clear that I forgot to introduce myself as, and letting you all know that I'm a citizen of the Nakota and Dakota people from the Fort Peck Indian Reservation that's in the northeast corner of Montana. I'm a descendant of the Turtle Mountain Ojibwe people and the Shoshone-Bannock people. And I am not interested in pathologizing my people or American Indian people in general. And so it's a very difficult balance, and there's a little bit of tension when we're talking about trauma in Indian country, because again, we have so many positive, wonderful, spiritual, cultural ways of being that bring healing and wholeness to us. And I want to emphasize that, but we're talking about those folks that are impacted by those traumatic events and wanting to provide support to our relatives. So that's just know that that's my intent, is always to define it first, take a look at it, take a look at its impact, but understanding that through all of that, we are still here as a people. And we have responded in really healthy ways to the challenges of our past, but also in some not so healthy ways. And that's who we're here to support. So some examples of historical traumas for American Indians, of course, there's disease. Everybody has probably heard about the blankets infested with smallpox that were given to tribes purposefully to annihilate them, kill them off. There's the starvation, not just on the long walks. For example, in Montana, every one of our tribes has a starvation winter story. For my tribe, we lost probably 7/8 of the Assiniboine people one winter when the cattle wagons didn't make it to the agency. And so our old people and our young people, our children died. Of course, the colonization, all of those strategies from removal to boarding school, to all of that sort of thing, boarding schools, broken treaties, the loss of our children in the child welfare scoop of the 50s and 60s that's continuing today, a criminalization of our spirituality. We could not pray the way that we are intended to pray until I believe it was 79. And then being, for many of us, we'd say incarcerated on our reservations. Today, we've learned, many of us were pushed out of our ancestral homelands and put on reservations, we've learned to create home, create identity in the place where we currently live. And so for many of us living on our reservations, we find it a place of healing and wholeness, a place of access to our culture and our spiritual ways. And many of us choose to stay, want to stay because of those reasons, because of our cultural, our family, and our place-based connection. So really wanting to help you guys know that historical trauma impacts are greater if both parents are exposed to an event. They're greater, and there may be some gender differences. I know for juvenile justice, girls often have much higher rates of distress and PTSD symptoms and events, mostly because boys don't as often as girls experience violence at the hands of caregivers. Girls often are have higher rates because they are the ones that are experiencing caregiver violence. We know that the impacts are for poor mental health and physical health and higher stress vulnerability because of historical trauma. And we know that there's some evidence that indicates that there's association between intrusive thoughts about our losses and effective outcomes, how we emotionally respond to those associations and those intrusive thoughts. We also know that many young people have the same sort of response, historical trauma response, as people older than 30. So you can see it's multi-generational, and you can see it's not, it's when are we going to get over it is a moving target, because a generation of children have the same sorts of responses to historical trauma, same sorts of scores as older people. Individuals with substance experience more distress related to historical losses than people who are not dependent on drugs and alcohol, which again, as we consider training with addiction providers, thinking about how do we look at historical trauma in that context? How do we help address the impacts of historical trauma in recovery? So many of us believe that what was possibly the most detrimental to our well-being as people was removal of our children. And everybody, General Pratt started Carlisle Indian School, and he basically said, kill the Indian and save the man. That was the strategy. That was the strategy, the colonization strategy, where it's sort of like these people will continue to perpetuate their culture, their languages, and their spiritual practices as long as the children are living in their households and in their communities. And what's the answer to that? Removing those children, taking them to a place to Christianize them and colonize them away from the influences of their family and their community. For many of my people from Fort Peck Reservation were sent to Carlisle. The Presbyterians had built a day school. Someone burnt it down. We don't know who. I think there was the belief that if their building didn't exist, they wouldn't have to go to school. So instead, they were shipped to Carlisle to experience the sort of deprivations that they experienced there. Again, reminding ourselves that this is intergenerational, and it's exposure of an early generation to a traumatic event, but it has subsequent impacts on subsequent generations. So now a little interaction. Can anybody tell me what is truer than truth? And even on Zoom, I'm willing to wait.
You can unmute yourself by just going over and clicking on the unmute button. Or if you're on your phone, I believe it's *6. I think there's only one person on their phone. If you're having troubles with muting or unmuting yourself, just send us a note or raise your hand and I'll be happy to unmute you.
So this is not a trick question and there is no one right answer. So from your perspective, what is truer than truth?
I would say individual perspective.
Individual perspective, good. Yeah. Anyone else?
I was going to kind of say something along the same lines that, yeah, there is objective truth, but when a person lives through something, it's their truth. And so their truth kind of supersedes, objective truth possibly, or I think, a person's truth is truer to them.
Okay, good. And we have Dr. Justine Saloni.
Yeah, that's right.
Great, thank you. Interpretation of the truth, right? It's an individual's interpretation or a community's interpretation of the truth. Well, for the sake of this training, what's truer than truth is the story. So we know that American Indian nations have unique languages, cultures, spiritual ways, food ways, familial roles, that sort of thing, community roles. But what we all seem to have in common is the experience of colonization and how we play that story out, or how we look at that story is what we're going to take a look at today. So again, you all were right. We're leaning into this sort of notion of my truth is my story because this is my experience. And so for tribal nations, that's our story, that's our truth. We've had these experiences with boarding school, we've had experiences with child welfare, we've had experiences with all of the strategies of colonization that were very, very detrimental to our well-being. So now I'm going to ask you to indulge me. I'm going to ask you to pretend that we're in that large conference room on La Crosse, and you're all sitting in the audience. I'm at the front, and we're going to do what I have called the boarding school experience. During graduate school here at the University of Montana, very late in life, one of my projects, one of my last projects for my portfolio was I produced and acted in, along with some other students, a play called The Strength of Indian Women. And it was written by a playwright named Vera Manuel, and she's a Canadian Cree woman who has walked on to the spirit world in 2010. But I always have to give attribution to her. She is the one who gifted me with this exercise. Creator has expanded on the exercise with me, through me, and with me. And it's particularly powerful in person. So let's try to lean into it emotionally, psychologically, and even spiritually. So I would be at the front of the room, and then I would hold up something like this, which is just a little Pendleton purse. And in this is elements of prayer. So I might have sweetgrass, I might have sage, I might have cedar, I might have anointing oil, I might have holy water, whatever our belief system is, right? And this is going to represent the sacred, the holy, the universe. And I would gently lay this on the floor beside me, and I will have talked to Annie and asked her to play the role of the child. And Annie would come up and she would stand next to me, and her foot would lightly touch this prayer bundle. And as I can only talk about my own tribe, so I'll describe it in ways that of our belief system. Some of our belief systems may cross over and have the same meaning, but I'll just talk from my Nakota perspective. So we believed pre-contact, and still do today, that pre-contact with Europeans or colonization, that that children are sacred, wakan, that when they are born, they literally come from the stars, they come from Creator, and they come to us as gifts, and they come with all of the wisdom of the universe. So the Creator has selected this man and this woman to bring this child to earth, to the world, for a very specific reason, to teach them lessons, to teach them certain things that are necessary for their well-being and the well-being of their family and community. And so knowing that that was our worldview, think about when Europeans hit our shores. By the time Europeans hit our shores in their history, women and children were chattel. They were meant to be exploited for profits. And then they come into contact with nations who believe in the sacredness or holiness of infants, children, adolescents, right? Okay. Then I would ask two people to come up and play mom and dad. Now here's where you all need to lean in, because you're going to play all of you are going to play every role. So mom and dad would come from the audience and they would stand with the child. And I would ask the question of the group. So I'm asking you now, how do you feel towards this child? And if you don't want to unmute, you can always put it in chat. Mom and dad, knowing what you know, how do you feel towards this child?
One person is placed in chat, they are a teacher. Another one said responsibility.
Okay. As a parent, you feel like you're a teacher. You're there to make sure that they learn the ways of your people. Great. You have a responsibility to this child. And the child is the teacher. Okay, the child is the teacher. Yes. So there's an expectation that this gift is going to show us something from Creator, something holy. And it might be that the Creator is going to show us a side as a warrior of being a nurturer, a caregiver, a lover. Okay. Anyone else? A connection. You have a direct connection to the Creator, and there's a almost purpose in your life, right? There's a direction that you want to go. You want to ensure the well-being of the child. Okay, good. So then I would ask grandmas and grandpas to come up. Now you're in the role of grandma and grandpa. And you would, yes, a protector, thank you, absolutely. You would come up and stand around the child. And every single time I do this exercise in person in a non-tribal setting or in a mixed setting, everybody lines up next to the child. And I'm like, okay, grandmas and grandpas and moms and dads, come around the child, encircle the child, embrace the child. And so we would adjust that during this process. And I would say to grandmas and grandpas, how do you feel towards this child?
I think you probably saw up on the chat, one person said protector of the child.
Yeah, so that was for the parents. Yes, thank you. Gratitude, yes, protected. You want to nurture. Gratitude. Why gratitude, Heather?
Gratitude for their being there, the survival, the continuing of the teachings in the future, and
Yes.
the carries being carried out.
Yes, good. I'm glad I asked. That's exactly where, right? As grandparents, you're grateful to know that your songs won't disappear, your medicines won't disappear, your people will continue on in a good way. Yep, definitely responsible, passing on all of the traditions. We're going to teach our girls, their roles in community. We're going to teach our sons roles in their community. Exactly. And that will perpetuate our culture, our people. Okay. So after we process that a little bit as a group, then I would say, ask you all to play the role of aunties and uncles. And I would have, depending on how many are in the room, I would have maybe 12 aunties and uncles come up and stand around the child, the parents, the grandparents, and now aunties and uncles. And tell me, aunties and uncles, how do you feel towards this child? Protective, honored, yep, absolutely. Why honored, Heather?
Honored to have that, the gift of that role in the child's life.
Yes.
To help in teaching and raising and guiding and learning from them.
Right, thank you. So we're not just aunties and uncles. We're not expecting mom and dad to be the solely responsible for the well-being of that child. Even grandma and grandpa, we're not expecting them. Aunties and uncles have a role to play in ensuring the safety of the child, the well-being of the child, and helping to raise a good, healthy, caring relative, so that our tribe continues to thrive as a nation, our family continues to thrive. Yes, and very humbled, right? This gift from the Creator, we're humbled with the opportunity to walk with them. Not mom and dad and grandma and grandpa aren't the only people that have been gifted with this child by Creator. Aunties and uncles have too. Okay. That's okay, a safe space. Want to make to be a source of security and a safe space. Absolutely. You are have the role of protector. You have the role of nurturer. You have the role of teacher. You have the role of, I was going to say coach, but that's a very modern Western European word. But to understand it in terms today, that's the role that you play. Wonderful. So after we process this far, I would then ask elders to come up from the audience, and elders come and surround the aunties and uncles. Come surround the grandmas and grandpas. Come surround mom and dad and child. Tell us, elders, how do you feel towards this particular child? Proud. Tell me why you're proud.
To be able to see a child in the community, you take pride in knowing that they are hopefully eager to learn and eager to carry on what we are going to teach them. Right.
Yep, a responsibility to love and guide them and help. Right. So here's the deal again. You all, elders, you all have a responsibility and a role in the life of that particular child. You might teach them certain prayers. You might nurture them in ways if they lose a grandma and a grandpa. You might step in that role. You might be an advisor to the mom or an advisor to an auntie, right? So you have a role in the well-being of this child. Anyone else? Trusting. Define what you mean by trusting.
I think about not just with that child, but with all the generations like surrounding that, the child, as well as us if we were elders, you know, and knowing that, trusting that we would all be taken care of and heard and supported and consulted and respected and all of those things.
Okay, thank you. It's that mutual engagement, mutual responsibility, mutual trust, mutual love, that the well-being of that child isn't just if, as an elder woman, I am I am teaching her, some medicines. It's very much about me supporting auntie or me supporting mom, and again, being the mom and the dad, or the grandma and grandpa, or the auntie or the uncle, modeling how we treat our elders, modeling how we support the extended family, modeling how we live multi-generationally in our communities, and all of the sacredness and goodness that means to us as a people. Yes, mutual trust and responsibility. Yes, thank you. All right. Anyone else? Okay, we've now processed that. So then I would ask one last group to come up. And I would call forth the warriors. And I would ask the warriors to come up and surround the family and encircle the elders who are around the aunties and uncles, who are around the grandmas and grandpas, who are around the mom and the dad and the child. Now, as warriors, how do you feel towards this child? Love, yes, absolutely. The child safe and protected, that's my role as a warrior, right? Feed the people, yes. Protect the people, that's my role. I have a role in the well-being of that child. I have a role to keep everyone safe. I have a role to keep everyone fed. I have a role to be a role model, to model the ways of men in my community. But the protection is the best part, right? We know that that child's well-being depends on mom and dad being safe, grandmas and grandpas being safe. And that means fed too. Aunties, uncles, everyone. So that's our role. We know our role. So you really can see that, again, just really bringing home the notion that the collective way of being in the world was how our children experience our natural, wholesome, cultural, spiritual parenting ways, okay? And it's about this time that I would step in. Now you're all visualizing the warriors, the elders, the aunties and uncles, the grandpas and grandmas, and the child. I would come into the middle of that circle and I would grab Annie by the hand and I would pull her out from the middle of the circle. And she would leave the room where you couldn't see her. And I would say that she needs to go to school. She needs to have, times are changing. She needs an education. So we're going to take her from you, your family, your community, and we're going to send her off to go to school at Carlisle. Okay, mom and dad, how do you feel? She's 5 years old. She's been removed from your home. And you may have been told what's happening, or you may not. You may have been told that she's being sent off to school to learn away, worried, scared, uneasy. Yes. What's really happening with my little girl? She's only 5, lost. Yes. That feeling of lostness is about what, if there are no children in my community, if there's no children in my family, what's my role? My role has always been about the well-being of our people through our children. Broken heart, absolutely. Absolutely. There's a Cheyenne saying that, that the people are not defeated until the hearts of the women are on the ground. There may have been a lot of hearts on the ground during this era. So you're heartbroken. Anything else? So, okay, grandmas and grandpas, how are you feeling? Sickened. Ooh, Heather, I like it. Why sickened?
Just like the most unimaginable nightmare I can possibly imagine, and it just feels like physically, emotionally, spiritually like sickened.
Yep. Yeah. We get to, and we might get stuck and say, I don't know how to get through this. What do we do? Feelings of helplessness and hopelessness, feelings of anger, exactly, towards those who took this child from us. And sometimes it was the agency, law enforcement, which were sometimes our own people, right? So keep that in mind as we move forward in this exercise. Yeah, so we can experience a lot of anger, frustration, loss, sickened in our soul sick, losing this child, not really knowing what's happening to that child. Okay, so if we have these feelings as warriors and grandparents and elders, how might we treat or start to react, or how might we start to treat one another? Oh, thank you, Paula. Yeah, just have to have a belief that they're being taken care of somehow, or we'd lose our minds sometimes, right? So how would we start to think and behave for ourselves and towards each other? What kind of behaviors might we start to engage in? Blaming, right? How come you didn't protect her? Where were you that day? Hey, you're the warriors. Why don't you fight for them? Well, elders, how come you didn't talk to the agency agent better? Aunties, uncles, you have certain roles in this community, and that's your responsibility. How come you didn't? Resentment, yep. Start to resent one another. Gossip, yeah, numbing. Yep. How would we numb, potentially? Feeling a sense of hopelessness, yep. Frantic, disrupted relationships, absolutely. No, but it's not just the community members blaming each other, it's family members blaming each other, right? We might start engaging really maladaptive behaviors like consuming alcohol in order to numb ourselves from the pain of the loss. So if we're blaming and we're resentful towards one another, what kind of behaviors might we engage in? Exactly. We might start behaving violently towards one another in frustration, in fear, in blaming, that sort of thing. Absolutely. So I've had the people that play the role of warriors start to walk away at this point. And I will have to say, warriors, come back. We're not done with the exercise. And they walk away because their role has been disrupted. They have no meaning. They have no purpose. They couldn't do their job, or they couldn't stave off what was happening to the children. Any comments? Sounds like someone's unmuted. Okay. After we've processed this together as a group, I'll go get Annie and I bring her back. And my Dakota name is Lightning Bear Nose Woman. And so she left, let's pretend. She left and she's known as Lightning Bear Nose Woman. She comes back and she insists on being called Annie. Now, when Annie was at Carlisle, she did experience deprivations. She went hungry a lot of the time. She didn't have experience physical or even emotional or psychological warmth. Maybe her sisters went with her and they always had slept in the bed together, but suddenly the 5-year-olds and the 10-year-olds can't be in the same floor together or in the same room together. She experienced harsh treatment for misbehaving, but she didn't understand right away what that meant. She had no idea what she had done wrong when she was little, but she quickly learned what to do and what not to do. And she also was sexually abused. So she has learned to relate to men in particular, in a particular way for safety, to keep herself safe and to ensure her own, not just safety, but her own endurance, her own surviving. Yes, good. Thanks, Heather. She learned to be very compliant and learned to behave in a particular way. But when she comes back, she's 16 years old. And she's lost most of the language, even though she might have returned a couple of times from Carlisle. She's lost a lot of, and most of the knowledge about ceremonies, about medicines, about roles in particular of women and daughters and sisters in her community. And when she comes back, your belief system is to be feared. At the very least of it, the impact, it was just that it was myth, right? It's not true what your people believe. It's not, that's not truth, that's not reality. The Christian way is the right and true way of being in the world. So she might not have the same respect for or care for your spiritual ways. Yeah, she's been told they're backwards, not holy. Sorry, my Yorkie. Bear, stop. Right, so she comes back with all of that and she comes back into community. Bear, stop. So sorry, y'all. I'll try to talk over the barking. Hang on, I'm gonna put myself on mute. There. So she comes back in and one of her grandparents tries to talk to her and she sort of is dismissive of grandma because she doesn't understand the language. She engages in a behavior with an uncle that's inappropriate and it embarrasses him and it shames her mom and dad, and her grandparents are just not having it. They're just embarrassed for her and ashamed of who she's become. And so she feels all of that. So now, child, how do you feel when you come back into your own family and your community? Annie?
With all the love and support and nurturing and all that I feel around me, the people that I feel around me and all the relatives I feel around me, it's wonderful. It's overwhelming.
But when you come back from boarding school?
Oh, when I come back from boarding school, I'm angry and feel disconnected and distraught, and I don't know where I am or who I am, and I've forgotten who I am and where I came from, and don't know who to trust and don't trust anything that I can say out loud. And I don't say anything out loud.
Mm-hmm.
And I've lost my ability actually to communicate and lost my sense of purpose, any connection with understanding what's going on.
Thank you. Yep, alone, isolated. Where do I belong? Where do I fit? A sense of uselessness. Everybody seems to, maybe I've come back at ceremony time and everybody seems to have a role and I'm just standing around looking like an idiot. I start to become depressed or even full of fear, right? So at about this stage, as we're thinking about the impacts on the family and the community and the impacts on the child, how do we bring this child back into this community, in this family? How do we bring Annie back in a good way into the middle of our circle? And I asked the group that in this large setting as we're standing in and she's standing outside the circle. How do we bring her back? What are some suggestions? Ceremony, open our arms and make her feel welcome, celebrate, bring back her spirit. Yes, absolutely. Purification and start over again. Yes, right? So we engage in our cultural, spiritual ways of healing. We have a ceremony, we have a purification so that the old Annie, when she comes out of that purification ceremony, is back and restored to who she originally was. We call back her spirit to herself. And she can enter into this family and this community whole again, healed, and become a purposeful, become someone who has purpose and defines meaning and support and love and nurturance from her family and community. So we would model that by just asking someone to bring her back into the circle. And it usually happens that whoever's playing a grandma will step outside the circle, take her, hug her, take her by the arm and gently lead her back into the circle. And you should see it in real life. Everyone comes around and comes in close for almost like a giant group hug because they're so happy. They're so happy to have her restored to them and restored to their community. And it brings healing to them too, to bring her back in a good way. Thank you. So that's the boarding school exercise. And the reason that I do that is to take sort of this researchy, intellectual way of looking at historical trauma and sort of naming off the events and naming off the impacts to really help us understand what was lost. Thank you, Brandy. I think it's powerful too. Because if we don't understand what was lost, we minimize everything, right? It's not that big a deal. Why can't they just get over it? So it really is about understanding that impact truly to the well-being of our kids. Any comments or questions before we move on? Paula, do you want to talk about the buffalo?
It's just that the circle that you created was like the buffalo when they need to protect the young. The young are in the middle, and then the cows have their butts to the young, and then the bulls are on the outside.
Awesome.
It's the same.
Yeah, right. Yes, it's very wholesome and it's very natural to be a community to protect the young. Excellent. Thank you so much. So here's, according to Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart's, some of her research, the consequences of boarding school is really thinking about ineffective or destructive parenting that occurred. So when Annie was removed from those nurturing cultural ways of parenting, and she was sent off to an authoritarian, harsh, disciplinary, cold way of being treated at 5, the only thing she knew to change behavior was harsh discipline, right? So when Annie comes back and she's a grown woman, she meets Joey, who has had the same experience. And they come together and have a child. And so if they don't have the support of grandmas and grandpas, aunties and uncles and elders and warriors, how might that sort of be so disruptive, right? They'll engage in abusive behavior. Oops, what the heck happened? There we go. They may engage in abusing or neglecting their child. They might be authoritarian with them, really inconsistent and often even rejecting of the child because of the rejection they may have experienced when they returned. Poor school relations for obvious reasons. Obviously, weak spiritual foundations. Maybe they were indoctrinated into Catholicism or Presbyterianism. And so their weak spiritual foundations are that they don't feel like they belong in either space, in either place, in either belief system. So there's that, again, creating those unhealthy family norms from what they've learned, and a weak ethnic identity, especially when you've been trained and taught that your language, you can't speak your language, you can't practice your spiritual ways, you can't engage in cultural practices at all because they're pagan, demon, whatever, backwards, someone said. So so now think about Annie and Joey creating generation after generation after generation of kids whose, again, generations continue to be removed, coming together and trying to create family and community. It's quite challenging. And so we think about the consequences today as we watch some of our relatives really struggle to raise children well, struggle to stay clean and sober, struggle to maintain employment, that sort of thing. So we're going to look a little bit, now that we've had the understanding of the impacts of historical trauma, emotionally and psychologically and community. Let's look at some of the research. So Duran has talked about the historical trauma as a soul wound, and I think you felt that in this exercise, right? Sickening or sickened was, I think, the word used. There's just this wounding that sometimes we can't even name. Obviously, we think about our different communities, whether it's Lakota or Ojibwe, wherever we're at, and how it impacted us as nations. And really thinking about historical trauma for American Indians as really, honestly, just colonization strategies of the federal government that were genocidal and ethnocidal, intentionally, with intent. And again, looking at how, and now I think you can see how it, multiple generations were impacted, not just Annie at boarding school, but all of the trauma experienced by the losing of those children to boarding school and to child welfare on the families and on the communities. So what we do know now, and we'll talk a little bit about Dr. Whitbeck's, is that there are related stressors that interact with our present day discrimination or feelings of discrimination that impact us as individuals, that there really is a trauma response or a colonial trauma response that we are engaging in and that we can't define. I know that walking across campus once with a colleague of mine, Dr. Gita Sweeney, and we were talking about historical trauma, and I said, you know, it occurs to me that I can walk across the University of Montana campus discussing historical trauma from a really academic tower, you know, and white tower. And my relatives at home live out the consequences every single day, and they might not know the definition or even the phrase historical trauma. How it's, some of the scholarship is around how it's being transmitted, and we'll talk a tiny bit about that. And looking at the social and psychological distress that continues to impact our well-being today in either our urban or rural reservation communities. So a historical trauma impacts how there's greater impact if both parents are exposed to an event. Again, there might be those gender differences for reasons that I described earlier. The high stress that we experience because of not just historical, but contemporary or chronic trauma really has impacts our mental and physical health. And we're much more vulnerable to chronic diseases and much more vulnerable to the impacts of high levels of stress. And there is some evidence that intrusive thoughts of historical losses affect how we feel emotionally, which we'll talk about now, I think, yes. So Dr. Les Whitbeck and his colleagues at the University of Iowa wanted to try to quantify historical trauma because it is just a theory, right? Still, it's just a theory. And they started asking, you know, a lot of Native folks started to say, really, does what happened to my great-grandma at boarding school really have an impact today on me? Is it really impacting my well-being? I'm fine, you know, I have a job, I'm raising my kids right. How is it having an impact on me? So they wanted to try to quantify it to sort of like prove that it does have a current impact. So they created a trauma loss and scale, and they interviewed elders and youth, and they asked the question, how many times do you experience, for example, the loss of land? Never, yearly or at specific times, monthly, weekly, daily, several times a day. And so as we look at this loss of our land, we think about it maybe at times of ceremony, right? 32%. But I think it's important to look at that daily. 10% of us think about the loss of our land every single day. Almost 30% of us think about the loss of our language every single day. Loss of our spiritual ways, 25% of us think about it every single day. Let's go down to losing our culture, 25%. The losses from the effects of alcoholism on our people every single day, 30% of us think about those losses. 24% think about the loss of our people to early death because of chronic disease, because of the impacts of alcohol. And the loss, I'm trying to move, there we go. Loss of respect by our children for our traditional ways. So we are thinking about it every single day, right? A lot of us, but does it really have any sort of impact emotionally on us? So that was the second part of the study, was thinking about and looking at when you think about these losses of land or culture or language or early death of relatives, how often do you, what kind of feelings do you have? Sadness and depression, anger, anxiety, shame, loss of concentration, loss of sleep. So let's go to sometimes over half of us will have feelings of sadness or depression when we think about those losses. Almost 40% of us will sometimes feel angry. 23% anxious. 22% are uncomfortable around white people when they think of those losses. 25% have a loss of concentration sometimes. Oops, sorry, guys. Fearful or distrustful, 18%. 22% feeling like it's happening all over again, or avoiding places where this happens. So how does trauma get passed down to the next generation? Let's take a look at that very briefly. Sometimes it's the narrative that children will hear in their households or in their community settings. They hear the stories of trauma. They hear the stories of great loss. They hear the stories of colonization from parents and grandparents and other relatives. Sometimes it's around storytelling and or secondary stress that can occur, because when secondary traumatic stress or traumatization occurs, not necessarily when we hear the stories of what's happened to the children, but when we have to constantly deal with the behaviors of traumatized children or students that can really create some secondary traumatic stress. Introjection, just making assumptions about that, some unconscious channels. And then we know that epigenetics plays a role. What I know about epigenetics can fit on my fingernail, but just knowing that some of our genes get triggered differently because of our stress. So there's this sort of very scientific reality to historical traumatic events. So here's some of the outcomes. There's evidence that these reoccurring thoughts of losses create stress for all of us, and that the result of are historic, but again, the origins of the symptoms may be attributed to contemporary experiences, which we'll talk about. There is also this notion of intergenerational transmission of healing. It's much less research, and it's research around resilience. And we have to remind ourselves that not all families carry the burden of what happened generations ago. There are so many healed, wholesome, wonderful families in our communities that we often look to as cultural and spiritual leaders. So we have to understand that we're working with the challenging behaviors of students or families, right? And that's not everyone. Let's not generalize to the whole population. And finally, just understanding that healing can be very difficult for a situation because, we face current day traumas and we continue to experience maybe chronic trauma or even complex trauma. So here's some of the historic events that have created historical trauma, and here's some of the examples of the impacts. We know that there are poor economic conditions on reservation. There's persistent discrimination and racism that we experience, not just at the hands of non-tribal entities or individuals. Within IHS, within BIA, there is this notion of lateral violence where there is, structural violence, where the very systems that are meant to support and help us they're persistently discriminating against us, holding us to a higher standard or a different standard. It's the old pull yourselves up by the bootstrap, sort of like, I got over it, you get over it. I got sobered up and got a job, you need to now too. It's not really that simple. Again, really having to deal with those chronic health disparities, diabetes, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, ischemic heart disease, the continuous underfunding of service systems. For example, Indian Health Service continues to be funded at 50% of need. We can't enjoy even basic healthcare access like wellness checks, those sorts of things. And there's definitely disparities in child protection and juvenile justice systems where we see much higher rates of youth and children involved in child protection. And the three big offenders are Alaska, Montana, and South Dakota. So historical trauma can have, again, those individual impacts, weak ethnic identity, behavioral health disorders, poor health outcomes, that sort of thing. Family impacts, severed family roles, lots of cultural parenting practice, those sorts of things. And then that community impacts, lateral violence, pervasive poverty, loss of sovereignty, severed community roles, and continued unhelpful federal policies that continue to plague us. For example, thinking of the Tribal Law and Order Act, creating safety in our tribal communities is still a challenge because we're still underfunding law enforcement and justice systems in Indian country. So there's this notion of systemic traumas, treaties that have been and continue to be broken. depending on who you talk to, which researcher, which historian, there have been over 400 at least treaties, and today not one of them has been fully honored that the federal government made with tribes. So imagine that, imagine knowing that not one treaty on education was a part of that, of those treaties. We were meant to be educated in a good way. Again, thinking about those systems of loss that impact us physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. So we're facing these current traumas in our community, right? That aren't historical, but will be in the future if we don't address them today. And really understanding that schools, child welfare, justice, everybody that has serves a tribal population is a human service system. We really do have to understand the past, the present, and the impacts of vicarious trauma on our students' well-being, the families, and our communities. Because if we don't, we discount some of the possibilities for change. So, generational perspective, putting on that historical trauma lens. So let me ask you, how do we view student behavior now that we know what we know today about the impacts of historical trauma on children, adolescents, and families? If we can all think of a particular student whose behavior has been really challenging, as you think about that student, can you think that perhaps some of the behaviors can be linked to some of the events that have occurred, traumatic events that have occurred for him as an individual, to his family, and to his community? How about how we view the community? You're in an urban setting. How do you view an American Indian family of the students in your district or in your building or in your classroom?
Compassionately and resiliently, because we weren't meant to be here. So the fact that we're all here and all the students and families, Indigenous students and families who are lucky enough and strong enough and powerful enough to be here.
Awesome. Love that. Thank you so much. Yes, that's the positive of the historical trauma lens. But can you think of some of the challenging behaviors of the child and family, and how maybe now, I like to call them trauma goggles, not trauma lens. I always think of the Minions, the little yellow people with the goggles on, to put the trauma goggles on and look at that behavior through that lens, to look past the child to the family, and past the family to the community, and past the community to the history of the community. So I think for me, it helps support the notion that that behavior that's happening in front of me isn't about me, right? Oh, somebody in chat. Yes, okay, family involvement, right? How do you engage families? Yep, trauma and boarding schools that prevented them from, yes, absolutely, Bridget, great connection. Great connection. It really has prevented a lot of families from feeling safe entering an educational establishment or a building. The schools on my reservation, they always have these parent nights or welcoming parents at the beginning of the year or celebrating parents at the end of the year, but they will not leave that school building. They will open the lunchroom, multi-purpose room, and have food, and still families don't come. And they don't come because, again, very often it's like the fourth generation of students whose parents and grandparents and great-grandparents went to that school and did not have a good experience. And I just begged, but couldn't do it, to get them to move it to the cultural building, right? Or to the tribal building, or to the college multi-purpose room, that sort of thing. Yes, especially education that lack Indigenous representation among staff. It's true. We need to see teachers and administrators that look like us, so that we can have a sense of ownership, of belonging to that space and place. And I tell you, I've worked with some BIE schools, Bureau of Education schools, and I've walked into some of those school buildings, and I've even said to them, if I didn't know where I was, I would not be able to tell that this school was on a reservation. I would not be able to tell that 100% of the student body are tribal members. Everything that you have on the walls, all of your art, all of your, all the language that you use is not tribal, does not represent any of the students here. So, okay, received resistance from teachers and administrators in bringing cultural awareness into the school, even though it was a requirement. Oh, yeah. I think that, I think a lot about that. And I think that a big reason is there is a lack of expectation for educators to come into school systems with the notion that, let me find out who these people are. Who are the Lakota people? What do I need to know about them? What are, their strengths, their gifts, their cultural healing ways? What are some of the words or language they use to describe health, well-being, wholeness, sacredness, anything like that? And let me hear their local history. Let me understand who they are in the context of Rapid City. How many tribes are represented? So I'm in Missoula, Montana, which is on the ancestral lands of the Salish people. And within the school district in Missoula, Montana, it's an urban setting in Western Montana, there were 52 unique tribes represented in the student body. Who are they, and really taking seriously, finding out who's in your classroom, who's on your playground, who's in your community. So again, just reiterating the trauma piece, it's very, very common. I think that that's the other thing too, is really saying and understanding that without wanting to pathologize or say, oh, those traumatized Indians, but understanding it's very prevalent. In fact, one study, Defending Childhood study, came out of the Department of Justice, and it said that over 90% of youth involved in juvenile justice had at least one adverse childhood experience that they could record. So we're going to look a little bit at development. I'm not going to, because we're lacking time, I'm not going to go on it. I'll go through some things pretty quickly. So we understand that brain development is sequential. First, the brain stem, it's those basic survival functions from pre-birth to 8 months. It's what some of us call the lizard brain. It's just the experiences of survival, right? That's all it's for. The cerebellum is those motor skills, developing the motor skills in our brain. It's learning to walk, learning to use our small motor skills to eat, to play, to do those sorts of things. And then the limbic system develops about 1 to 4 years, and that's the emotional center. And this is where we have to help support our young people, our early childhood folks, in learning how to manage and understand their emotional centers, understanding their behavior, emotions, and helping them to regulate those emotions. And finally, the reasoning and judging center is the last to develop in 3 to 6 years. So just knowing that all of those neurons create pathways. And for those that experience a lot of trauma, that's an overdeveloped part of the brain. So we're constantly in that state of high alert, that fight, flight, or freeze, or fawn state where we're always surveilling our environment for safety. And that includes a classroom. And it's because we have repeated experiences of trying to survive, whatever that looks like, trying to survive because of lack of food, or trying to survive because of exposure to violence. So helping you guys know that students in your classroom that have that overdeveloped limbic system, that they are often triggered and don't know that they're being triggered, right? They're not saying, oh gosh, I'm really angry because, and that reminders of trauma can be are mostly sensory, particularly smells. So there's a story of, again, but it could be sights, sounds, a touch, a taste of something that reminds them of the trauma that they experienced. We had a little girl in one school district. She was a third grader, and she loved going to music. And then when she came back to school the following year, she didn't want to go to music anymore. And what the teachers finally figured out and the counselor finally figured out is that in order for that third grader to go to music, walk to music, she had to walk by the kindergartner's coat, where they hung up their coats. And the sight of those kindergartners' coats reminded her of her favorite little cousin that drowned that summer, right? Or the young boy who every time he sees the color turquoise is triggered because his mom was severely beaten by a boyfriend, and she was wearing a turquoise shirt at the time. So we really do get triggered by, and understanding that even when you're in that classroom setting and somebody starts to behave in a particular way, they've probably been triggered, and our responsibility is to find out what did that, because they get immediately into that fight, flight, freeze, or fawn phase. And we know we're well-intentioned, right? We know we are safe adults. We know that we're caring adults. We know that we have the best interest of that student in our hearts, but children don't know that, right? Especially children that have learned to live in that survival mode, right? So your best intentions can actually trigger a child. So that's why it becomes really important to understand and learn to identify trauma triggers, and develop a strategy to respond and help them cope with their triggers. So what kinds of potential traumatic situations have your students been exposed to?
Not to be too obvious, but they're going to school in Rapid City, South Dakota.
And what does that mean, Annie?
It means that we are a community that has not been able to find a way to the truth. We live in a community that has extraordinary lateral violence and straight out violence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And our kids are exposed to that on a regular basis, and they hear things and witness things from before they're even born and come into this world.
Mm-hmm. Yep. What other kinds of traumatic experiences do they do? Oh, here, let's see, chat. Not physically safe, right? Exposure to the drug use of caregivers, methamphetamine, cocaine, heroin, guns. Yeah, access to guns. Witnessing mom being treated violently, or primary care provider being treated violently. Food insecurity, right? Not enough food in the house. A sense of safety in the house, lacking that. I worked on my reservation, and I was a part of a CPT team, and a pair of sisters came to our attention, and because of truancy. And so they weren't lazy and they weren't avoidant. What we did find out, though, that they were living in a household with a sexual predator. And in order to keep themselves safe, they would stay awake when he was awake. So that meant that they had to stay awake till 3 a.m. sometimes. And so when you're 15 and 17 years old and you are responsible for getting yourself up, dressed, and off to school, it becomes really challenging to get up at 7 o'clock or 7:30 to get ready, right? So they were in danger. One was in danger of not graduating. One was in danger of not moving on to the next year. But it was a brilliant strategy, right? But it was personally costly to them. And that's the kinds of thing we have to be aware of. What are these kinds of behaviors that our students are engaging in that might not be about what, that might not be defined by the way we've defined it, want to define them. Yes, loss of loved ones, the grief and loss that the youth experience all the time. So wanting to really bring home that trauma impacts emotional development. The children and youth really have difficulty with self-regulating their emotions. They have a lot of difficulty describing their feelings or internal states, right? They're triggered and they don't know what triggered them. They're triggered and they don't know why. And they're triggered and they don't know what to do with their physical reactions. And so they have a hard time communicating. So part of the role of caregivers, yes, often have so they've got this mad, sad, glad, right? They can define that. I'm really mad, I'm really sad, I'm really happy, right? I can define those. But as caregivers, both of young children and older children, we have to help them develop a whole array. It's like, I'm not mad, I'm frustrated. I'm frustrated or I'm anxious. I don't like standing in line. I want to make sure, I want to make sure that there's enough food in the lunchroom. I don't want to be at the back of the line, that sort of thing. So I have anxious feelings about it. Yes, thank you, Heather. Incarceration parents. Yeah. So thinking about how often and how we help them as young children and even adolescents begin to understand the emotional impact of trauma and how to better express themselves or learn to regulate themselves to express their emotions. So this is a really cool demonstration that I wanted to show everybody. There's a study, and I can't remember the researcher's name. Yeah, a feeling vocabulary. Thank you, Paula. At the moment, but he took some children, probably middle school age, of those that were abused and those that were not abused. And he asked the not abused children where, from right to left, where the man and the woman where they saw anger in the face. When did it stop being sad and it went to anger? And so for non-abused children, it was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So for the non-abused children, somewhere in the 8 and 9 is where they saw anger, right? But because these children are constantly surveilling for safety, where do you suppose the abused children saw anger? One, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 4. Okay. Paula says 4. Anybody else? Okay. So children who had experienced abuse, Paula, you're right, probably around 4 and 5 is where they began to see anger. Now, do you see anger at 4 and 5? I still see sadness in 4 and 5, right? But again, always surveilling for safety, always watching the caregiver. When I got to protect myself, so I got to make sure that I read the signs, I read the expressions, because I need to get out of the way or seek safety when I see her start to get mad. Now, think about this as a teacher and what your expressions might do to impact a student who has experienced a lot of trauma. You might be thinking that you might have a flat affect, right? You might just be thinking, sitting at the front of as people are taking a test and you're just You know, maybe working on the grade book and you happen to look up and look out the window, a student might be triggered by just your expression that you think is just, what am I going to have for dinner tonight, right? So just being very cognizant that that they are always surveilling for safety. I'm not going to go here, just to let you all know that there's a real trauma impacts the ability to attend, to concentrate, to memorize, and engage. And what do we need to be successful in classrooms? We need to attend, we need to concentrate, we need to memorize, we need to engage. Okay. Paula, what do you mean you have your 11s made smooth?
Botox, TMI.
Oh, these 11s.
Yes.
Okay.
Because I have stigmatism. So I squint a little, and one time a school board member said, "Don't scowl at me," and looked at me. And I was like, oh my God, I was concentrating. So as I get older, I'm really aware that the kids will see that as being mad or being mean. It does help to have a mask, since we're all masked up now, but I do know that they read that. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. Good example. So then also, again, that experience that they're always in the lizard brain, the survival brain, so their executive functioning to the ability to attend, concentrate, and memorize is decreased. Excuse me. Definitely a decreased reading ability. But I want to go down to the special education referrals. When I used to train a lot of teachers, I would ask everyone, how many of your special ed referrals are because of behavior rather than a concern about a cognitive delay? All the hands went up, right? Don't know what to do with this kid anymore. You know, she's blown out of class. She can't maintain, she can't sit still, she can't do, you know, so they start looking for all the solutions for it cognitively, and it might just be, it's based in a trauma history that's unexplored and unrecognized. Impacts on relationships. They seek attention very often in all the wrong ways, right? They reach out inappropriately to their peers, to their teachers, to even their primary caregivers. They can be hyper alert. They can be impulsive, aggressive, avoidant. Worked with a girl who was a cheerleader. She was raped by a basketball player at a house party one weekend, and she quit cheering the next week because she could not stand to hear his name called out every time he made a basket. So just avoidant behavior, something that she loved and enjoyed, she could no longer tolerate. Impact on worldview. Our children are looking at and understanding the world as a dangerous place, that people can't be trusted, that they're not worthy enough, they're not smart enough, they're not good enough. And worst of all is things will never get better, that sense of hopelessness. So let's go to the question 2, very briefly. I'm assuming that some of you have worked and understand a bit about the impacts of trauma on educational outcomes. So do you have any strategies that you've come up with that could be helpful for us that have helped your student or students? Well, let's see if we can come up with some. Okay, so the idea is, instead of pathologizing and using negative language, instead of trauma-informed schools, we like to say trauma-resilient schools at the trauma center. So really, it's understanding that a trauma-resilient school, really at the beginning, what you guys are doing is acknowledges the prevalence of trauma, and also becomes sensitive to the unique needs of each student. Oh, good, yes, giving fidget objects. essential oils and Play-Doh, that sort of thing. Cool, love it. But being really understanding the unique needs and being able to identify the behaviors that don't criminalize or pathologize or stigmatize a student. We have what we call the 3 tiers, multi-tiered, and we're going to look a little bit at these universal strategies. So I often have tribal members say, you know, here you come again, giving our kids another label, right? Tribal school board members, you're going to label all the kids. They already have enough labels. And what I like to say is the strategies that we like to employ in a school setting are universal. So what's good for a traumatized student is good for a non-traumatized student. What's good for a student with a disability is good for all students, right? That humane treatment, that understanding, that being able to be heard, right? Yeah, thank you, Ashley. Yes, keeping snacks. We have a strategy going to happening here in Missoula where the kids are not, they're in households where no one, we're going to go probably, let's see what slides, because you're going to have a copy of the slides, okay? So let's end with this because I know you're wanting a break. There are additional strategies for supporting students for trauma, and a big piece of it is manage your own affect, right? Getting rid of the 11s, recognizing our own responses and attitudes to what's happening with that individual, reframing our thoughts about that individual. He's not a bad kid. He's a kid who's been triggered. He's a kid who struggles with direct instruction. How can I help him cope? Again, tuning into students. So here's the biggest thing that you need to remember is about wearing the trauma lens in a classroom setting is what is the function of the behavior? What is happening in front of me is not about me. What is the function of that behavior in this moment? What occurred before this student was triggered? And how can I now help now that I realize that this is about trauma and the student has been triggered and perhaps I've been the one that triggered them by my behavior. For some students, it's proximity. So leaning in to help a student with a problem or leaning in to say, good job. You think you're being a good supportive teacher and you've just triggered that kid. Right? But it's not about you, but learning and understanding that. And being able to learn how to respond. And most often it's just affect regulation, being able to stay calm and help, and in those stay calm, stay centered, help the child do that, student do that same thing, have strategies that give that student a break. And then in those moments that they're not triggered. So I've seen some of you talk about the strategies used like with the essential oils or that sort of thing, teaching breathing exercising, teaching self-regulation, teaching thoughtfulness and mindfulness, teaching them strategies to be able to identify what triggers are and how they would like to cope when they're not triggered, when they're centered, and reminding them over and over again how to use those strategies. Okay, so here it is, asking you to reflect as a final item. What's the function of the behavior? What does that student look like when they begin to fidget, when they begin to hit another student, whatever it looks like? What does it look like before there's an explosion or a shutdown? What are the clues that are there that things are starting to get difficult for that student? What are the ways that he reacts when his buttons are pushed? What might he or she have been feeling when, have you ever noticed other times when they get triggered? And what was going on right before it happened? Because that can be a clue, right? To what has triggered the student. It does sound like that, Annie, all of us. Being decent human beings and humane human beings and living in a world mindfully and thoughtfully, considering others, yeah. That's the big secret around trauma-informed care. Yes, those are so many students don't act out, but they begin to shut down, right? They stay quiet, they stay at the back of the room, they put their heads down, whatever that might look like. And so it's those students that we have to be able to identify. And that's a big piece of becoming trauma-informed. How do you identify the students? And now I will just end here. That, again, we have to acknowledge in our schools building, in our classrooms, in our systems, that we're all related. And when one child is hurt, we're all hurt. And the opposite is true as well, that one child is protected and loved and put in a place of honor, the entire community benefits, the entire classroom benefits. Okay, questions? Sorry, everybody. I'm not getting through it all.
While
Anybody?
people are forming their questions, I want to remind everybody about a couple of things. There's a survey in the chat, and there is the CEU registration. So please fill out both of those. There's no reason to pass up the credit. If you don't need CEUs, you can get a college credit for it. And I know that there is so much information here, and I just need to deeply express the gratitude for Marilyn's presentation. This is so much easier to do in person. Doing trauma-informed training is so hard to do on Zoom because it's really about the conversation and the dialogue and witnessing us being mindful of one another in the presence of one another and seeing each other respond to it and our own individual reactions. So Marilyn, thanks so much for doing this. I know it's so challenging. Please, anybody, any questions, please unmute yourself and ask away.
And I want to thank all of you for leaning into that boarding school exercise. That was wonderful. All right. No questions, no comments.
Some folks were disappointed because they thought that you were going to noon and they think that this is just such great information.
Oh.
You also received hearts from people.
Okay. Oh, sorry, but you can have the PowerPoint slides.
I will send them out.
All right, thank you so much. Jean, do you want to do so one of the things we as Indigenous people do is when we open something, when we open a door, we open a way, we close it too. And so for this time together that we've had this morning, I want to ask Brother Jean to close out this morning and send us on our way in a good way.
Okay. Thank you for the awesome presentation. And I humbly ask Tukashla Bakatanka to look over us and be with us, and keep us safe and protect us. Help us to, like we prayed earlier, help us to retain the information being presented. Humbly ask you, protect all of our youth, our adults, our elderly, our communities, our world, Tukashla. Humbly ask you, be with us and watch over our communities.
Thank you. I'd also like to let you all know that as a trauma center, we're funded to work with schools and child welfare agencies and all those folks to become trauma informed or trauma resilient. And so if you are interested in further training, coaching in order to develop or a trauma informed classroom or building or your whole system, please reach out to Annie, who knows how to reach out to me. And we'll start, you can request a TTA request through our through our website, which is didn't send it to everyone, which is www.nnctc.org. Let's see if I've got it in the last slide. Nope, but there, and then also there's my professional email address where you can reach out also. And we would be delighted to begin a conversation with you. So this isn't the end of trauma resilient schools. It may be just the beginning.
Again, thank you so much, Dr. Zimmerman, for your presentation. Thank you, Brother Gene, for opening and closing us. Please fill out the survey and complete the registration form for Sitting Bull College. We will have this information up on the Great Plains Tribal Leaders Health Board YouTube site. Make sure you're looking at the Leaders Health Board YouTube site. There's 2 of them. So I will send out the link for that along with the slides. And this is just the beginning of trauma-informed care and trauma-informed resources. The Circles of Care grant through the Great Plains Tribal Leaders Health Board will be providing more information and opportunities for organizations, agencies, groups, individuals to learn more as we continue on this journey together of learning and healing together. Again, thank you so much to everybody. We look forward to seeing you soon in our community.